Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And I said, with or without the microphone?
Yeah, we can hear you without.
Well, my children can hear me without, too.
Yeah.
Very good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another, and I have a script, so you're going to be here listening to talk this way. Welcome to another educational event. Dan Gagnon and the Turn of the Century of Danvers is our presentation today. And this event is sponsored by the Friends of the Peabody Institute Library of Danvers. I'm Ellen Clarkson, I'm the president. And don't blame me if anything else goes wrong. Anyway, no, you can blame me totally. Before we begin, a little background on the Friends of the Library. We are a nonprofit 501c3 volunteer organization dedicated to promoting awareness of the library and to offer additional cultural and educational, like this program, not already covered by the town budget. One of our key contributions is financially supporting the library's Museum Pass program, which offers free or discounted admission to 50 museums and educational venues located in Boston and on the North Shore and around surrounding towns. Our funding comes from members' fees. It's $20 a year to join. Grants, donations, and our annual book sale in June. If you are not already a member of the Friends, we hope that you will consider joining. There's a membership form from the back table up to the side for the refreshments, and some other information of things going on. It's a terrific way for individuals and families to support education and culture in our community. Our next Friends, after this one, our next sponsored event is on Wednesday, October 23rd from 4 to 5. The author is Raj Tawney, and his book is All Mixed Up, which is appropriate for readers from grades 5 and up. We're assuming middle schoolers may come, and we're hoping, but if they want to come with a parent or grandparent, but you probably would get something out of it no matter what age you are. But before we begin, please silence your phones. Restrooms are in the hall, and the key for that is in the children's room, the men's room and the ladies' room. Water and refreshments are on the table, which some of you already taken part. They're provided by the Friends of the Library, our nice, helpful members. And now, we are pleased to have with us today historian Dan Gagnon, who will speak on Turn of the Century Danvers. Dan, who is a lifelong resident of Danvers, is the author of A Salem Witch, The Trial, Execution, and Exoneration of Rebecca Nurse. And Dan has spent many years researching the Salem Village Witch Hunt of 1692 and Danvers history in general. He holds a degree from Providence College in history and Boston College, and he's currently teaching history in the Rockport High School. He serves on the board of directors of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead Museum in Danvers, is a member of the Danvers Historical Society, and serves on the Town of Danvers Salem Village Historic District Commission. He has shared his research through many in-person and online programs, including C-SPAN's television programs, American History TV, and he has served as a subject matter expert for local media. During the month of October, which is what we're in right now, you will find him on Saturday mornings giving a walking tour of several Salem Village historic sites in Danvers related to the 1692 witch hunt. You can book a tour and take a walk with Dan around town at salemhistoricaltours.com. And you can learn more about Dan at his website, danielgagnonhistory.com. Okay, please join me in a warm welcome for Dan Gagnon.
All right, good afternoon. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Well in the
Yes.
back? Good, awesome. Well, it's nice to be with you this afternoon. This time of year, as was mentioned, I'm often talking about the witch hunt, and this is a nice total change of pace from that, a very different topic, totally unrelated. And so I was happy that the Friends had asked me to come talk about this. With Danvers at the turn of the century, it wound up being a topic that kind of had way too much for us to put into one presentation. So I've kind of choose, we will talk about several different sections of town, what some life was like, what some businesses were like, and really the, I guess the original idea for this was, a few years ago I had written articles for the Danvers Herald on like local history topics. And one of them was I'd come across the brochure, like the program, for Danvers's 150th anniversary in 1902. And flipping through the program and seeing different things, the celebration itself we'll mention at some point because it's a giant parade, it's a big event. But with a piece of history like that, what's almost interesting is the stuff that's not important, like all of the ads for the businesses in town, and kind of see like what you can learn about everyday life, not just the week that they were putting on a big party. And so that was sort of what was the foundation of my idea here. We have the square. I'm sure most of you have probably seen this photo somewhere along the line, looking down at, well, where the flagpole kind of would be today. With Danvers, as we talk about different sections, there's a lot that's kind of familiar. A lot of places, a lot of institutions we have were there at the turn of the century. We'll see some things that are very familiar and some things that are definitely not. This building was here. Being the second building, this was built in 1892, so it's within our time period. Town Hall looks a little different with just the central part of it before the wings on the left and the right are added. And of course, the state hospital has started in the late 19th century as well, out in the Hathorne section. Our population is 8,500, so that is different. And one of the things about town that I have always found fascinating is, for that amount of people, it's interestingly spread out. And it's really spread out into different neighborhoods that are all centered around a train station as the most important method of transit. So the blue dots is my amazing computer graphic skills overlaid on the map. I wrote down the names of the stations, so east to west. I think I have a little red. You got the Hathorne station that then becomes the Asylum station. The names kind of all change down through here. And I mean, you can see for a lot of what we talk about, the square is the commercial center because they have two stations. That's where the two tracks had a junction. So that's where most business is. And we'll talk a little bit about the port. And of course, the old Danvers Center had two stations as well. Danvers Center being up by the First Church. They really in colonial times is the center of town. But by the turn of the century, that has shifted to the square. The other interesting little public transit one is how we had so many streetcar lines in addition to the train. You could hop a trolley to like anywhere. That we had such a public transit system is kind of mind-boggling. You could take it, where it says Danvers, that's just the square. You could take it out to the First Church at Danvers Center. You could take it down 62 and 114 to Lawrence, take it up to Putnamville. It used to go to Topsail, but I guess not by 1910. You could take it down Elliott Street. You could take it down Bridge Street, back when they still had a bridge that worked. You could take it down Water Street into Salem to Peabody Square. And so we do end up having a lot of movement, even though you think that this is like a pre-car time and people would be just trapped within walking distance. It's in some ways like easier to get around then. And yeah, we have the nation's summer capital too. President Taft spent his summers in Beverly. So I think that's the promotional reason for the map, is to advertise you can go see where the president's staying. Now, as I mentioned that program, and some of these business ads, they are a variety that shows a town that's going from agriculture to what to them is some like very modern stuff, maybe not from our quite perspective. We have new gasoline engines, and throughout that's how they spell gasoline. They actually spell it two different ways throughout the book, so I guess we hadn't decided how to do that yet. Other new inventions was that you had a steam laundry in town. You have electricians advertising speaking tubes that you could have installed, which at first I wasn't sure if this was a weird name for the telephone or what this was, but it would be in a factory. I think we actually have one of these at one of the playgrounds in Danvers. It's a pipe, and at the end it opens up, and you yelled into the pipe, and then the voice came out like 2 floors down on a factory floor. High tech. There was a good one also where you see streetcars kind of like intersecting with the old agriculture. There's a guy selling pigs, and his ad says, "Not all hogs are found at the end of streetcars." As if your rude neighbor is a streetcar. And he is actually selling pigs. That is his business. And we also have Zola, which of course is still one that we would be familiar with. We got Luciano Zolo, who is a champion hair cutter. You gotta sell it, I know, that's good. Bay of Naples Shaving Parlor. He did come from outside Naples, like within sight of Mount Vesuvius, and then comes all the way to Danvers Square to set up his shop. Elsewhere, from things at the time, they call him Louis Zolo. I think maybe Luciano, the old Yankees in Danvers maybe couldn't quite pronounce Luciano the right way. Now, with our sites around, we have Corner Market. This is where CVS is. And really, in the square, Pearlie's Market was there from 1800 to about 1940. And really, it kind of serves the exact same purpose as CVS. All right, different business, different building, but it's a convenience store and they had some groceries. It's essentially our same thing. So we've had that sort of an item there for centuries. And although that building is, of course, not CVS, the bank building is there. It used to have a third story. Now it's just a flat roof. The First National Bank building used to be, was it last Santander, I think? Yeah. So we still got the corner. With businesses like this and some others, we have the telephone in Danvers, which is kind of interesting, your small town telephone. They don't advertise any phone numbers, because in a town like this you didn't really do that yet. All they had is the words telephone connection. And you picked up and talked to the operator and said, "Get me Pearlie's Market." And it was a small enough town that they knew exactly who you were calling and you didn't need any more information. We also have ads for businesses that have like weird combinations of things. You wouldn't really think would all be under one roof, but people at the time are doing a lot of things. So a Boleto table at the top, it's like a pool table. I'm not sure when the name for it shifts. So you got pool tables. You also have cameras and all kinds of talking machines. The talking machine shop. These you think are very different skills, and that one would be a specialist in the high-tech voice recorders isn't the guy selling your pool tables. At right, you have refrigerators, and then screens for your window to keep the flies out. Also odd. What is weirder is you might think, okay, you had a refrigerator at the turn of the century? No, that's an icebox. They called it a refrigerator, even though that's not at all how we would have described it. But they used that word before you ever had a machine. We're going to get back to ice a little later on as well. With advancements, a small town trying to become modern, we see some really strange things having to do with like medicine. It's a little hokey. This dentist uses electricity to numb your teeth before he works on them, which I thought sounded kind of horrific. I did look into it, and it is a treatment for like pain and muscles still today, but not with putting it in your mouth. That's a whole different thing. This is a weird, brief use in dentistry between laughing gas, I've been around for a while, and then 3 years after this ad, they came out with Novocaine, and people stopped using electricity in your mouth, which is a good move.
And when was that?
So this is 1902, so it'll be 1905 is Novocaine. At right is a different dentist here, and apparently you have to send the message that you are qualified and definitely not a quack or anything, that you have a picture of you graduating from dentistry school. So everybody knows you're legit. There's no question about your credentials. He's in the First National Bank building, either on the second or third floor next to where CVS is. So really focused on the square. Another, to me, weirder medical thing is he had a couple products. These products just seemed like snake oil in some senses. You have a lot of weird cures, especially in the late 1800s. We don't have the Food and Drug Administration yet, so nobody's actually testing these. Not only does it work, but also could it actually be harmful to you in some other way, like a weird side effect. This is not supervised yet, not regulated. So here you have anti-itis that cures everything, apparently. Lung troubles, tonsillitis, consumption. I really don't think it cures tuberculosis. I don't think that. Inflamed breasts, rheumatism. You got boils, bruises. I'm unsure what a felon is. Insect bites, milk leg, it's a vein inflammation. You got wry neck, the classic housemaid's knee, and then enlarged joints and frostbite. So it'll cure anything under the sun. And with this one, I thought it was interesting because I'd never heard of this, of course. And I saw that they had a laboratory on Oak Street, which immediately I thought sounded, I'm sure laboratory is making it sound way better, and it's some tiny little building. There's no like commercial historic building at 8 Oak Street. It's a modern looking house today, so I'm not really sure what happened to it. But somehow Oak Street sort of like stuck out in my mind from, I guess, something else I'd seen in the book as I was flipping through it, this pamphlet, and I wasn't really sure. So I looked into it. And I'm like, all right, well, it says trademark registered. So who owns it? Like, who is making this product on Oak Street? And it's made by the Standard Crayon Company. So I definitely would not use this product. You get your crayons and your cure-all from the same laboratory. That's very fishy. What's interesting, though, is when I was just searching online, it's advertised in like the New England Journal of Medicine and like all of these real medical journals. So we might laugh at it, but they thought apparently this was serious. With our businesses, most of these are all in the square that we've talked about so far. And I definitely didn't just want to talk about Danvers Square. So I have a picture of somewhere very far away from here for us to get to. We could almost see the library if it was right here. We have Pond Street, and that is Sylvan Street, heading towards the satellites by the cemetery there. With our industries all over, you have things like coal yards on Holton Street, you have greenhouses across town, someone on Endicott Street who's advertising that he has a gravel pit and he'll sell you sand for your farms. We have wagon makers on what's now 114. And we had some mills at Tapleyville, Tapley's carpet mill. There were like iron foundries in the port, as well as shipping in the port. It really has spread out that near all of these train stations, there's some commercial hub. The pond is kind of a different story here. The pond is two. First of all, you have a lumber mill. Well, it's the mill pond. And you also get out of this ice. When you might not be doing a lot of work with lumber in the winter, you can get ice. And here, this is not from that brochure. This is from the 19-teens, and there is a, I don't know why I have an equal sign, but there is a telephone number at this point in time. But still, ice and wood, two products that go together. Also sawmill. With this, the mill pond had been used for a sawmill for about like 250 years by the Putnam family. This has been long-standing, going back to colonial times. And so Sylvan Street is the dam, which is why there's a small stream in the cemetery, and then the other side is flooded. It had been a meadow, one of the Putnam's meadows. And what ends up happening is sort of, not intentionally, as things change, they realize, hey, this could be great for the ice industry. It's not the original purpose, that's not why there was a dam, but you can sort of double dip. And the ice industry is something that's going to be growing at this point in time. As you saw the ad for the person selling refrigerators or ice boxes. Now, Otis Putnam is the person who was running the lumber yard at the time, and he's the one who adds more boards to the dam to raise it up. It is like a privately owned dam at that point. And what they would do is you take horses out on the pond when it was frozen. Now, yeah, I know you're not even allowed to skate on it now, but back then you could have a horse and a cart on the pond and it was frozen. You'd go out and you'd draw a grid with some metal tools, and then you'd have the horse with a big piece of equipment that would like go into the groove of your lines, and that's what would slice blocks all the way across the pond. The trade in ice was very lucrative, and something that always kind of amazed me is, so you have in the background the ice houses, and later there was another one, kind of like on the front lawn of the electric light department, kind of that side of the pond too. Somehow, and I'm a history teacher, so I guess I'd have to ask a science teacher for this explanation. You stack up all this ice, and you put hay between it, and ice and hay between it, and it actually does last through the hot weather. That's one of those things that at first glance you think, what is this, like 2015, when you had that snow that didn't melt till July? But it is the same concept that if you put cold next to cold, it keeps itself cold. But it's amazing. And then moreover, what we see is there's going to be ice from Danvers shipped to England to sell and not melt on the way, apparently. So I just think that's interesting. I need to figure out more about that. This ice, though, you're not going to make a drink and put the ice in it. Number one, it's valuable and be kind of a more frivolous use. The second reason is in 1901, the town of Danvers had to talk to the State Department of Public Health, and it is not good water to be making ice out of. So you did not want to put it in your drink. The state comes down and says, you can't harvest the lowest level of ice. Apparently the top's okay. But if you get to the bottom, then it's too contaminated to use. You really think you shouldn't use any of it then probably, but you could use some of it. But only in your ice boxes. With ice, Putnam's company is just in Danvers. It's just selling to regular consumers, someone around town. Here you have them cutting it there. You got a horse on the pond. Trying to see, yeah, we do, it is cut through there. There's water there, and they're still standing on it. So this is a 1900 photo. That's another one of the ice houses that are, it is today kind of right in the middle of the cemetery. Later on, the cemetery bought that land to make it part of the cemetery across the street there. So you don't really see it. All you see is when the stream goes through the cemetery, it's a very clearly defined channel, which is the only like remnant of that. Here's your Iceman going around to deliver. Looks like a cowboy out delivering his ice. You have little kids. You see some of the tools for separating the ice, because once you put it in the cart, it would, like the ice blocks stick together. And some of like the rakes to scoot it by. Now the ice industry, as I mentioned, kind of takes an international twist to England, which far ways to be trying to do an industry such as that. This is the house across the street that you may have driven by to get here, right on Peabody Avenue. So Joshua Sylvester lives in this house. It's architecturally important as one of the first to be built out of cement. And just interesting that you have the little carriage house that's an octagon. It's usually why people talk about this house. It's sort of its like architectural importance, and it's interesting. It's different. Using what is it? Portland cement as the outside. And originally, of course, it owned like the house lots around it. It was a mansion home. Joshua Sylvester doesn't live here at first. He had lived in the square. He had a shoe factory in the square. We're getting to the time of shoe factories, not quite leather factories, but it's clothing factories. And in the 1840s, the whole square had burned. Sylvester lost his house, he lost his shoe factory, and he had been a very prosperous person. He'd been very rich and is out of his luck. He ends up hearing that there's a big demand for ice in England. And he knows that somebody in Salem, this guy Charles Lander, is harvesting ice from Wenham Lake. He talks to some of his friends who had not lost all their money, some rich businessmen in Salem, and they put together a company. They buy Lander's ice business, and they're going to take this Danvers really Wenham ice to a much wider market. The only reason that's doable at this point is you had the railroad. Before that, this was not possible. You always had the ships going to England, but you didn't quite have the way to get it to the ships. Now, with this company, to put it in perspective, I wrote down some numbers. Out of the mill pond, they got, at least at the height, 6,000 tons, which is a mind-blowing number. The industry at Wenham Lake, from 1860 to 1880, at their height, got 30,000 tons of ice that they are shipping. This is a truly enormous industry, and yeah, much larger than I would have imagined that you could do with ice. By the time we get to them selling it internationally, this ice is not contaminated, apparently. And they try to sell it to the British as cold drinks. They brought bartenders from Boston over to Liverpool to teach them, like, all right, you have Scotch whiskey or something, try it with ice. As a like marketing thing to try to get their product sold, because the British, I guess, weren't into that yet. I don't really know why we were ahead of them with ice. You think they could make ice, or anybody else? But the important thing is that all the ice did come naturally. It was possible to build a giant machine to make ice. It was just incredibly cost prohibitive. Nobody would have done it. Your ice would have been too expensive, which is why we rely on the natural. Now, I also had a quote from a newspaper in Liverpool. So 1892, they had an article, and the big headline is "Ice is King," which describes Danvers' ice company on Wenham Lake. And the article noted that they had even given a gift of ice to Queen Victoria. And that the royal family was pleased by this new luxury. They were pleased. With the ice overall, the mill pond section of the ice industry, the ice barns end up burning down in 1935, and that's kind of the end of it. I mean, we're also moving towards refrigeration, so that's the end of that. With big businesses in Danvers, we're now going to shift down to the port. We have William Penn Hussey. His statue at the fork of Water and South Liberty Streets, right by the Home for the Deaf, is one of only 10 equestrian statues in all of Massachusetts. But it seems unlikely we'd have one in Danvers out of 351 cities and towns, that we're one of the 10. So yeah, it's right up there with, Paul Revere, the Common Public Garden, and such. Now, with Penn Hussey on his horse, we always end up with misconceptions that he looks like a military man. It's probably furthered along because he's wearing the uniform of a general in the Continental Army, which, definitely would lead to this misunderstanding. Hussey is not that old, obviously. He's 1846. He was not a Continental soldier. Yeah, he's a guy from Maine. And he ends up settling in Danvers Port and dealing in shipping, but primarily coal. And he also kind of takes Danvers business in a new international connection. This time it's Nova Scotia. It's not quite as much as Liverpool. With Penn Hussey, his depiction is probably his biggest moment, which is the parade for the 1902 150th anniversary of Danvers. He's the chief marshal, and he rode a white horse in that uniform. So that's the moment that's captured here. The parade in 1902, he had a 1,000 horseman honor guard in front of him. 75,000 spectators. Remember, there's only 8,000 people in Danvers. So 75,000 spectators. With his background, he came from Maine, North Berwick, not actually too far out of New Hampshire and into Maine, pretty close. He ends up being a cousin, or he was, of course, a cousin of John Greenleaf Whittier, who we'll talk about later in a moment. Whittier, of course, being in Haverhill, not Maine. Now, he had a sketchy childhood for somebody to become a respectable figure in Danvers and a respected businessman. He, in North Berwick, was known for causing trouble, and he eventually leaves, and he tries to go to California to, make it rich. Prior to him leaving, it almost seems like there could have been some pressure there. There was kind of a biographical article written about him in his heyday, that pointed out, as a teenager, he liked pranks. He, on a St. Patrick's Day morning, that was a Sunday morning, he didn't go to church. And instead, he was outside the church, and while everyone else is inside, he painted the minister's horse green, which probably be an issue there. But he goes west. It's,
That's a green horse.
you're right, it is. You think of all these people, go west to California in the 1800s, whether you're going to try to find gold, whether you're going to try to be a cowboy, whatever. And he goes into that, and it doesn't work. He's various jobs. He's a rancher, a brakeman, like on a train. A newspaper also attributed to him as being both a cowboy and a hobo at different times, so not quite his level of success. He comes to Danvers in 1874. He's just a farmhand. He ends up later on moving on and working at the state hospital, just as an attendant, not like as any sort of medical professional, but just as a hired hand there. And what he ends up doing is he gets a pretty good break. While he's at the state hospital, he has a very wealthy patient from Martha's Vineyard, from Edgartown. And he took a shine to Penn Huzzy, apparently giving him good care. And when that person was released, he's going back to Martha's Vineyard. What the person decides is he wants to hire him as his personal aide in Martha's Vineyard. So hey, he goes to Edgartown, he has a wealthy employer, and then he falls in love with that guy's sister, and they get married. And that kind of brings him into a family that has money and really changes that trajectory on his life. When he returns to Danversport, he has a small-time warehouse, coal distributors, just like the ice cart. He had a coal cart, went around selling coal to heat homes and such. Then, when they inherit money from the family, he decides he wants a business venture. He wants to be a big-time coal guy. Not just delivering it, but mining it, really distributing it throughout New England. And he invests in this Nova Scotia mine. The Nova Scotia mine is beyond his ability to fund himself, and he needs investors. He goes around trying to get people in Boston to invest, especially he makes a connection with a steamship line, of course, out of Boston. How are you going to get your coal here? Steamship, makes sense. And the other thing that he does is he, with Nova Scotia being part of the British Empire, he goes to London looking for investors. He gets to go address the House of Lords. They're literally lords, they all have a ton of money, and try to get them to be his investors in Nova Scotia. And what he does is he parlays this modest fortune that he got into becoming a multimillionaire, and he's one of the richest people in New England at this point. He's up in Broad Cove, Nova Scotia, which is there, and this is from his company's prospectus, the annual report, but also you're trying to sell it to get more investors. So that's a good image of him. It's one of the few good close-ups we have, I mean, other than the statue, I guess, of what he really did look like. And although he's William Penn Huzzy, it's usually referred to as just Penn Huzzy. He's named after William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. I couldn't find if he was actually a Quaker, but it kind of seems likely if you're named after the father of Quakers in America. Now, his business takes off, and he constructs Riverbank, which was until recently as a home for the deaf. And this is his mansion, and that's why the statue is across the street. Truly one of these, at that point, unsurpassed homes in Danvers. Danvers, we have a couple others we'll talk about, had some country estates, or a country seat like Whittier and Oak Knoll, Glen Magna, something like that, but they weren't like this. Brick, stone, this higher level, and this wasn't just his second home, this was his primary home and really where he conducted business as well. He had a warehouse, if you think of where this is, directly opposite the river, where that Dunkin' Donuts on Water Street is, that was some of his wharfs right there. So he had this whole hub. And although he is extraordinarily wealthy, he was very good to the people of Danvers. He sent his children to the public schools, the Holton High School back then. He could have afforded any school in New England, but he sent him to this community. He really tried to join this community, perhaps because he had moved around so much in his life, he was looking to finally be a part of one. Later in life, before he ends up selling his coal business and distributors, there were about 1,000 accounts locally that owed him money on their coal accounts, and before he sells off his company, he just erased all of those debts of people in Danvers, Peabody, Salem, the surrounding area. His big moment is that parade. And the 1902 celebration of Danvers' 150th, there's a Globe headline about it, and the headline is "Spent Money Freely," and it's him who is basically bankrolling it. The town meeting only appropriated a tiny amount of money for this celebration. And Penhuzzy thinks that this is inadequate, and so he will cover the rest. He has floats, pulled by horses of course, floats, so that all of the 1,500 Danvers Public Schools kids can be in the parade. He buys them all, hires all the horses, good, they're all in it. Which to me actually sounded like a lot of school kids given how big the town was. Now, he has horses, saddles, he hires at his own expense marching bands from Boston, from other places, hey, come on in. And it ends up being such a show, which is why you get 75,000 spectators. He has a formal banquet that he hosts at the mansion as sort of one of the culminating events of all the elected officials in town. The governor comes, all the other state officials. And one of the other things is he has, they organize races between the Danvers fire companies. These are the volunteer fire companies at that point. He also hires somebody that I very much thought was sort of an insulting way to put this. There was a bicycle race, okay, and then the halftime show is a, quote, rube, who gave a unicycle demonstration, and then a rube meaning some country bumpkin is sort of the term, but that's how he's officially described, as they had a rube. Now, being the Grand Marshal, the parade is 6 miles long, and is described as taking 2 hours to go by. So this is enormous. I'm not sure if, I think in my time, Danvers' 250th, and in 2002, yes, I was not that old, but I was there. And that was an enormous parade, but it doesn't quite get us to 6 miles in length. Also, what we see is included, and partly why he, I guess, wears a Continental Army uniform, even though it has nothing to do with him, is we have a lot of veterans groups as well that are present in it. You just ended the Spanish-American War, 1898 to 1899. They're in on it. You still have some Civil War veterans around. They're in on it. And the 75,000 people, sort of the last part of that I wanted to mention, is the newspaper, the Globe, describes them as, quote, swarming into Danvers to see the parade. They come by steam trains, streetcars, horse-drawn carriages, and it quoted some people from Salem as pointing out that the train coming from Boston to Danvers even had people on the roof because they couldn't fit in the train to get here, which I can't imagine. Now, his death is interesting unto itself in a sort of way. He did have a little bit of an ego, I suppose, and wanted to be remembered. Fine. Now, with it, it's mentioned here in the Globe as a standalone article because he was of that much importance in Massachusetts. The Globe at the end of the year did a article of top headlines from the past year, and his death is one of the most important Globe headlines for 1910. So of really high level here. He didn't want to be buried, though. He instead, he wanted to be mummified and put in a glass box in front of his house, standing up, mummified. And because that was his home, and he didn't want to leave his home, was his reason. Now, I guess it was never in his will legally or anything, but his son does not do that to him. Well, of course not. He's also not buried under the statue, which is a misconception that I know that some people have. He's buried in Harmony Grove in in Salem, in a very like simple, just stone with the rest of his family. His son builds the statue 3 years after his father's death. The statue, if you look at it, is looking right towards where his father's room in the mansion was. Like it's facing that way on purpose because he had such a connection to this area. And what ends up happening is his son does end up giving away a lot of money. His son himself becomes important in business in Boston, kind of not too related to Danvers. He lives in the mansion for a while. With the building, in 1925, Hussey's son, meets Helen Keller. That kind of has a real impact on him. And she's talking about the need that she has an organization in, at that point it's either Cambridge or Somerville, it's just north of Boston, trying to help people who are blind and people who are deaf, and they've outgrown their small little building. And he sees this as a really sympathetic story and a real need. So what he does is he sells the mansion to them at half cost, which is an enormous property, and it had fields and fields and fields around it. It's bigger than just the house. Later on, interestingly, when he gives it, he also gives them the statue. I don't know, a little unusual, but he leaves them a fund to take care of the statue, like a separate account, because he doesn't want that to go away. As part of the account, it's kind of odd, and I'm always interested in like historic preservation in town and such, and it was one of those things like, oh, we got a privately owned statue, this is just kind of weird. Like, what could happen to it? There's no like protection for it. It's one of only 10 in Massachusetts. Just kind of interesting. And I had looked at his son's will. I've never been to the probate court in Salem before, and it's probably just as well. But I asked, and I was only there like 10 minutes, and they immediately pulled out this will from the early 1950s, and it was such an easy archives experience. I was shocked at how easy this was. And when he left them $35,000 in the will, there's weird requirements about the statue. They are required to maintain it, and if they don't want to anymore, they first have to offer to give it for free to the town of Danvers, were they to ever do that. And if Danvers ever said no, his will requires the statue be melted down, sold as scrap metal, and give all the money to the North Berwick, Maine public schools, where his father had come from. Even though his father doesn't sound like he had the best time in North Berwick, Maine. So he is looking out for other people with his money. I mean, look, he made $2,500,000 in $1,900. That's a lot of dollars. Moving over is his cousin. And with John Greenleaf Whittier, it's one that we probably think of, I think of myself as like hearing about him in a high school English class. That's probably where he kind of comes up the most. He moves to Danvers in 1876, so actually only 2 years after Hussey in 74. And he is from Haverhill, Amesbury. And Oak Knoll is his mansion. In theory, it's his second home, but it really becomes his primary base of operations during these years. And it's something that he prefers, I think, artistically, if he's writing poems, back when Summer Street was very quiet and fields, that was the place he could do his most writing. So that is where he was productive, that's where he could, his poems have a lot to do with nature sometimes, you can kind of see how it fits, as opposed to, big towns like Amesbury. With his home, it is a little it's almost like a miniature park. You have the house, that's the front of it that we just saw. Here's Summer Street. This would be the prep back here. You have a nice driveway. You have an actual knoll. There's a reason it's Oak Knoll. There is a little hill. And all these different trees, formal gardens, and then woods, and then it goes back to, it's kind of like swamp, just a whole bunch of swamp land there. He is one who wanted to be known for more than just writing poems. And a lot of his poems do talk about how he wants to be remembered. He's particularly involved in anti-slavery. Now, of course, 1833 is before he's moved to Danvers, of course. But that was his main cause, and he hangs out with a lot of reformers in the mid-19th century, and he's very much somebody into action. And here's the quote where, like, yes, all right, he's a resident of Amesbury, but that he no longer really considers his home because of his time at Oak Knoll. With the people that he hangs out with, we have an incredibly wide variety. At left is Dom Pedro II, the Emperor of Brazil, who he hangs around with. And in theory, Dom Pedro did visit him at Oak Knoll when he was coming to Boston for something else. Dom Pedro, so in our time frame, of course, in America, we've abolished slavery by the 1870s when he's at Oak Knoll. But they hadn't done that yet in Brazil. And that was sort of what they were meeting about, that the emperor was saying that he wanted to abolish slavery. He thought a lot of the rich people in Brazil would be really mad about that. And trying to be like, how did your country do this? Like, what can we, which, yeah, as the comment, yeah, not well, I would agree, right, a civil war, maybe not the best, the best way. But really talking about, well, he had written all these letters. He had tried to get the word out about slavery being bad. How can we work with that? And some of the other people, Frederick Douglass at the bottom, William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote The Liberator, the anti-slavery magazine out of Newburyport. A lot of North Shore reformers. Dorothea Dix is the one in the top right, who I think is probably a less familiar name. Big into reform, and part of it is the conditions of people in the state hospitals. So she, of course, has writings about the Danvers State Hospital and such, and she's the first woman to ever address the Massachusetts legislature, like to give a speech to them. Top middle is Samuel Tilden, who, depending on who you ask, was elected president in 1876. It's a big, big problem. He's an interesting companion to Whittier. In some ways, they're both reformers. Tilden is New York City lawyer, anti-corruption. That's his focus, and that's why the Democratic Party picks him that year. He runs against Hayes, who you might remember as actually becoming president in 76. But it's this weird showdown really having to do with southern states not allowing freed slaves to vote. And the election is challenged because of that, because they weren't letting freed slaves vote. And so it comes to the showdown, but it's interesting how that does happen while Whittier's at Oak Knoll, and he has letters with other people of the how has our country, year of independence number 100, how is our centennial going so off the rails? And his friend is one of the people involved. President Grant had to send federal soldiers to Washington, D.C. because they thought there would be trouble. And it is a real mess, and one that Whittier was sort of appalled by. We also think of him locally. Again, I
Can I say something about that
sure,
election?
please.
That election, Tilden won, people believe, but a deal was made. And the deal would be that Reconstruction would stop. So, 10, 15 years of blacks being able to vote, et cetera, the military would leave the South and leave it in charge of the whites who had the Klan and changed history.
You end up with the former Confederates back in charge of the
Yes.
southern states. It's essentially the end of it. So it's there's a whole bunch of different phrases, the corrupt bargain, the various things of what did you trade away to get to the White House? And the answer is half of America. Whittier, so yeah, I can't do a presentation and not talk about the Whittier. At some point in time it's going to come up, of course. In the 1880s, they put up a memorial to Rebecca Nurse at the Rebecca Nurse homestead. And Whittier had written poems. He has won the Witch of Wenham, and had really been interested in that as a topic. And when he's living in Danvers, not far from the Rebecca Nurse homestead on Summer Street, he is asked to write the inscription. And he agrees. He agrees. He writes to the Nurse Memorial Association. He's immediately on board. He likes it. He kind of workshops a couple different ways. So like that's his final version. His early versions are just slightly different. It's the same brief poem. With it, it really is convenient in the sense of Rebecca Nurse's family that the most famous poet in America lived down the road. That just works. So this is what he writes about Nurse there. He had said that he didn't want, normally under a quote, you'd put dash John Greenleaf Whittier. He had told them that he didn't want his name on the memorial, only Nurse should be there. He also said that it's some line, don't worry, I won't be forgotten. Like he doesn't need his name there, which I guess we're talking about him, so I guess he was right. Yeah, so Whittier dies 1892. Oak Knoll's torn down, 1958, and we have Greenleaf Drive. So the knoll would have been like right here-ish, and the front of the house would have been here, and the house kind of went back like that way. With this was sort of an important loss in Danvers in the sense of getting people riled up about historic preservation. I mean, you could just think, all right, you have a housing development that could have just been left as one of the houses in your housing development. It really gets people sort of riled, and I didn't want to end on a historic preservation loss, I guess. So I wanted to end by talking about Glen Magna. Glen Magna is interesting because it both very much predates like the turn of the century Danvers, but also being there, it very much postdates our conversation today. This is my picture, it looks a little blurry, probably, so that's okay. Our main people at the turn of the century here are William Crowninshield Endicott Sr., that's his wife, Ellen Peabody. No, I should have written in her portrait's in a museum in Boston. I think it's Museum FA, I think it's the Fine Arts. With Endicott, he's somebody who descended of John Endicott, like the pear tree on Endicott Street, going way back to the 1600s. But his father was a ship captain out of Danvers port, back when we had more of a shipping industry. His father and Ellen Peabody's father were both involved in shipping. Her dad owned the ship, his dad is the captain. That's how they presumably met. And they have a really bad time. His father, on the ship. The ship is the Glide, and it's one of those 1800s like wild shipwreck stories. They get shipwrecked in Fiji. There's a bunch of cannibals involved. Not all of them make it back to Danvers. It's a real harrowing sort of story. He does make it back, his father does make it back, and he tries to get his own ships, his own foot in the ship business, but his son, William Crowninshield, is the one we think of with Glen Magna. He'll become important in politics, especially. He is a lawyer. He'll be a justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. That isn't enough. He runs to be governor of Massachusetts. That doesn't work out for him. So instead, President Cleveland is going to make him the Secretary of War in 1885. So that's his main role when he's living at Glen Magna. That's sort of why he's prominent in a certain sense. His family also, further on, is prominent just being wealthy lawyers in Boston. They sort of have that angle too. But the political position is what's important. What's interesting is their daughter. Their daughter, who's always Miss Endicott, is going to marry a really important British politician. Now, they met in Washington, at an event at the British ambassador's house. Endicott was there. He brought his daughter, and that's sort of how it comes about. Now, thinking of the British Empire, this really is sort of the height of it. Literally the sun does not set on it. And Chamberlain is involved in not like home government, but the empire. He's going to end up being the colonial secretary. So India, that's his problem. South Africa, that's his problem. And there's a lot of problems. he takes Mary Endicott to London with him, but they return often to Glen Magna. When they're there, they meet with important American political figures. It's sort of an interesting, they picked a summer home in Danvers because it was kind of out of the way, but then they bring all of these important people out of the way to come visit them. And it works out well in the sense that it is, thinking that all of Endicott Park belonged to it, it is kind of a private spot where people could come and have meetings and visit. Now, Chamberlain is the reason that the gardens of Glen Magna, one of them is the Chamberlain Garden. He wanted a formal garden and helped lay it out. We might kind of think of his two sons. So one son wins the Nobel Peace Prize, Austin Chamberlain, as British Foreign Minister. Okay. His other son is Neville Chamberlain, who gave Czechoslovakia to Hitler. So, a little mixed legacy. Now, with him, the father, as an advocate, the husband there, of British imperialism, he really ends up getting involved in a lot of the dirty aspects of British Empire imperialism in a way that makes him very unpopular. Especially at this point, you have, we're kind of past, the large Irish immigration to Massachusetts, and Ireland isn't very keen on the British Empire. This is when they're trying to get home rule, they're trying to get self-government. And who stands up in Parliament as one of the lead spokesmen against Irish home rule is him. So he very much kind of puts a target on his back. There's one instance where, while he's in the garden with his wife, a Irishman from Massachusetts attempts to assassinate him. He sees him sitting on a bench next to his wife. He's creeping through the bushes of the Chamberlain garden, and he has a pistol and doesn't. The way it's told is because he saw him sitting next to his wife, and that's why he changed his mind at the last minute. But I have that as an example of just his singular unpopularity, and the other part of him is during the Boer War, 1899, 1901 in South Africa, where the British government does really horrific things to people. Our first 20th century system of concentration camps and things like that to put the Boers in. He is, in theory, in charge of that. And so he is a very controversial figure here. There's one, Danvers. Danvers gets itself a headline out of this. He's invited by William Crowninshield Endicott, who is on the board of the Danvers Historical Society, to come to the Danvers Historical Society, which was then downtown, before the Page House. They had upstairs space in one of the buildings in Danvers Square. The idea of, like, we'll have a little tea ceremony, a tea reception in your honor. He's British, so it's the tea reception. And great, and then he's asked to kind of give a few remarks, and it's kind of your prior century's version of a, like, political gaffe that ends up being a newspaper firestorm in Europe. People in America get really mad at him. He says that the English-speaking peoples are the most superior, and therefore America and Britain should, the goal is like somehow essentially like ally or reunite or something, because they are like the most advanced people. Well, you can imagine what the French think of that, what the Germans think of that, and how to them they see it as a threat. And so that ends up being a lot of political blowback, even though he's just invited for tea. And it was not a political event. It wasn't supposed to be. He just accidentally made it into one there. And then he continues to have, after that, all these Boston newspaper reporters are knocking on the door of Glen Magna, and they're telling them, like, he's not home today. You know, he's not going to talk to anybody about that ever again. With the end of our talk and the end of Glen Magna, oh, here, I have him in South Africa. Could have put that up earlier, I guess. The Derby Summer House comes to Glen Magna through the Endicott family. It's built 1793, far before our time period, but it doesn't come to Danvers until 1901. It is the only National Historic Landmark in Danvers. There are many buildings on the National Register, but the National Historic Landmark is a higher level. It has to be truly a nationally significant structure. It's truly architecturally is the point. Elias the Haskett Derby had it in Salem, so he's an important shipping and trade figure. So it has a historical connection. It's really architecture. And what we end up with is fortunately very different than Oak Knoll. When the last of the Endicotts are, we have a generation that passes away, we have a generation that doesn't want to be there anymore, that's going to move, we have a success in preservation. First of all, it's a little interesting. Louisa Thorne Endicott, the last one to live there, deeded the summer house to the Historical Society to preserve it, knowing that that, in her view, is the most important part of that site. But it's not the place, it's just the building. Sort of odd way to go about it. And then, so a few years later, the whole place is put up for sale. It was going to be 276 house lots. And in 1963, the Historical Society bought the mansion part as like an island, assuming the rest of it was going to be house lots. But eventually, there's pressure put on the town, and it's purchased as Endicott Park. So out of our estates, the three we talked about, Oak Knoll is the only one we've lost. I should have said Penn Hussey's mansion is no longer the home for the deaf, it's condos. So I'm sure the inside is gone, but it looks the same, it's still there. And then Glen Magna is, authentically preserved by the Historical Society as it was. So we still have some of these connections to this time, even if we're not using, speaking tubes and weird creams and things like that. So we at least have some physical connections. That is what I wanted to share. Oh, look at that. Exactly 60 minutes. Oh, wow. It's the first time I haven't gone too long in a while. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate you being here. If you wanted to hear more maybe about the witch trials, I do have some books for sale as well in the back corner. But thank you for coming, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Oh,
That's what I was going to ask you, if you're willing to take any questions.
oh yes,
Sure.
ma'am.
It isn't so much a question, it's more relating to the ice and how they packed it and kept it cold. At least in Vermont, and I'm assuming they did it here too, they packed it in sawdust.
Yes.
So being a sawmill there, that's probably why I got the idea of putting the two together, because they had plenty of piles of sawdust around, right? And then packed with ice. And that would have been how it would have been shipped to England too. So, yeah, so just wanted to make that point.
That is a very good point, and I never put those two businesses as literally together.
Yeah.
Also, in the ships, it's below deck, and the ocean is very cold, and the ice is not going to melt quickly. It's in straw or sawdust, and it can go to South America and still be lots of ice.
Yes, ma'am, Mrs.
Yes,
Smith.
I went to the Cape Pond Ice and Gloucester for the tour, and they explained that Queen Victoria loved and preferred Wenham ice, but most of their ice came from Sweden, so they named one of their ponds Wenham Lake. So that she, like they asked, is it from Wenham Lake? They'd say, yes.
It's a brilliant marketing. And with the British market, I guess one of the other things I didn't mention is that with Sylvester and such, they do actually have to go other places than just Wenham Lake to meet that market, that they do set up like a European division as well, just because, Danvers and Wenham can't handle all of the United Kingdom. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to say that if the ice were questionable as far as the health department was concerned, I remember as a kid there were still some people with ice boxes, and they would come to deliver the ice, and the fellow would see the sign how much ice was needed, and he'd use his ice pick and break up a big block, put it on his shoulder, and leave the truck. As soon as he did, a bunch of kids would run over and take those chips and put them in the mountain.
Oh, no. Yeah, Mr. McKenna.
An interesting story about the site where the mill and the ice house were. Many of you probably remember Len Sherry, one of our old timers, unfortunately no longer with us. When he was a teenager, he and some of his friends decided they were going to build a skating rink down there near the mill pond. So they built a frame, filled it up with water, went home, came back with their skates the next morning, go skating, and there's no ice. They couldn't figure out what's going on, so they tried it again, filled it up with water, went home, next morning, no ice again. He scratched it, started digging, it was all sawdust from the mill, and the water was just soaking right down through it.
Yes.
I happen to be a historian too, and Whittier was correct that he would be remembered partly because Snowbound is still occasionally referenced. And from the musical world, actually, a Northern Irish composer, Stanford, actually set words of his that go something like, "Dear Lord and Father of Mankind." It's a very pretty tune, and it's often sung in New England churches, most often probably Episcopalian and congregational. But it is the words of Whittier set to a British composer, which is something that has continued Whittier's legacy even beyond people who don't know of his poetry.
Oh, that's excellent. I had no idea that it was turned into music. Oh, that's excellent. Other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us more about the Derby, what is that called?
Summer house.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that.
Sure, so it, go back to it.
And they're collecting money.
The Historical Society is good plug, good plug. That's important too. So this is a summer house or a tea house. It's a concept we don't really have, but when you had your big ship captain mansion in Salem or Peabody or surrounding areas, it got really hot. And in the summer, you would go here to have your afternoon tea. The bottom is not really much in the bottom other than a staircase. So you'd have your little tea party up here with all of these windows, and it would be nice and cool as the breeze is coming by. And so it was just kind of a place to cool off. But it was also used as a status symbol. If you have one of these, it's a sign that you are not just a ship captain, but one of the elite. And what we have, the woodwork is done by McIntyre, like the McIntyre Historic District in Salem, the famous wood carver. Those architectural features are what kind of propel it to be the National Historic Landmark. Just that he was the most famous architectural wood carver. I almost feel like that's not a fancy enough term for it, but there. And so you have the statues, but also just the columns on the side and such. And so it's kind of the period style.
Is that located at Twin Magna?
Yes, it is.
I don't know why.
Yep.
Thank you.
It's kind of off in the back. Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the schools. When we first moved to the area and I was a young child, the Putnamville School was still operating as a one-room schoolhouse. And it had a sign in front saying it was the oldest continuously operated one-room schoolhouse in the United States. And it closed not long after that, but I wondered, what was the school system like, you know?
With, before the building of the Holton and the Richmond in the 1920s, so at the turn of the century, that early picture of the tiny town hall is also the high school, the second floor. And for primary school, grammar school, you had several of those neighborhood little schoolhouses. You have, I won't remember all of them, but yeah, Putnamville is a good surviving example. You then have Fox Hill on Endicott and Water. There aren't many of them left. I mean, like nationally, most of those just got torn down and they built a bigger brick school over the old little schoolhouse. So it is interesting that we do still have those two, at least. And I remember somewhere, I won't remember the year, 1950s, early 1950s, I came across one of those little booklets, like the annual town report, of like what had the town built in the past year, building permits taken out, public buildings, maintenance or whatever. And that was, they were talking about replacing they were using that as a bad example, like, we're the last people who have a one-room schoolhouse, you know? We should build a modern elementary school at this point. I don't recall exactly what year, but we did go, in that case, right from that to like, you know, a school like Great Oak or Thorpe or a real modern school, but there was no little like intermediary. That's a big jump. All right, well, thank you very much for coming out. If you have any other questions, I'll be in the back, but thank you so much.